There was a woman whose voice could shake an entire room the moment she stepped on stage. But almost no one knew that the same voice was trying to silence the loneliness she carried inside her. This is one of those nights. A night that began as an ordinary evening at a small club in Greenwich Village, and ended with a question that would follow Janis Joplin for the rest of her short life. A question about respect, about rivalry, and about what it really means to be heard. It was the late spring of 1968. Greenwich Village was the beating heart of a new kind of music. Folk singers, blues players, poets, and rock and roll dreamers walked the same narrow streets, smoked in the same dim cafes, and watched each other from the corners of crowded rooms. Everyone was trying to be the next great voice of a generation that did not yet know what it wanted to say. And in the middle of it all, two very different artists were rising at the same time. One was a young man from California named Tim Buckley, with a delicate, soaring voice that critics were already calling otherworldly. The other was a young woman from Texas named Janis Joplin, whose voice was the opposite of delicate. It was raw, cracked, full of weather and wounds. She did not sing songs so much as she bled them. But the real story of that night does not begin in the club. It begins earlier, with a feeling Janis had been carrying for months. She had just come off a series of performances with Big Brother and the holding company that had left her exhausted. The reviews were strange. Some critics worshipped her. Others wrote that she was screaming, not singing. That she was a spectacle rather than a musician. That her voice was a trick the audience would tire of within a year. Janis read those reviews. She read every one of them. She would carry them in her bag, folded into small squares, and pull them out when she was alone in a hotel room. She did not show this side of herself to anyone. To the world, she was wild, fearless, untouchable. To the mirror, she was still the girl from Port Arthur who had been voted the ugliest person on her college campus. Some wounds do not heal just because the world starts clapping for you. So on this particular night in May, when a friend told her that Tim Buckley was playing a small set at a club just a few blocks away, Janis decided to go. Not to perform. Just to listen. She wanted to disappear into a crowd for once. She wore a long coat, tied her hair back, and slipped into the club with two friends. She found a small table near the back, ordered a drink, and waited for the music to start. But the music did not start the way she expected. Tim Buckley walked onto the small stage with his guitar. He was 21 years old, handsome in a soft, almost fragile way, and the audience welcomed him with a quiet, respectful silence. He played a few songs from his early albums. The crowd loved him. He had that voice that seemed to float above the room, never quite touching the ground. And then, between songs, he started to talk. This was nothing unusual. Singers in Greenwich Village often spoke to the audience between songs, telling stories, making jokes, sharing thoughts. But what Tim Buckley said next would become one of those small, unconfirmed moments that lives in the memory of those who claim to have been there. According to several people who later told the story, Tim Buckley made a comment about a certain kind of singer who, in his words, mistook volume for emotion. He did not say a name. He did not have to. In the spring of 1968, there was really only one singer in America who was being talked about in those terms. The crowd laughed. A few people clapped. Tim moved on to his next song. And here is where the story becomes interesting. Because the truth is, we will never know exactly what Tim Buckley meant. Maybe he was talking about Janis. Maybe he was talking about a whole genre of singers. Maybe he was just making a general comment about a style of performance he did not personally enjoy. Tim Buckley was an artist with strong opinions, and he was known for being honest, sometimes too honest, about what he liked and did not like in music. He was not a cruel man. He was a young man with a young man's certainty about art. But Janis was sitting in that audience. And in that moment, she did not have the luxury of wondering what he meant. She heard the words. She felt the laughter. And something inside her went very still. Her friends at the table noticed it immediately. One of them later said that Janis did not move for almost a full minute. She just stared at the stage, her hands flat on the table, her drink untouched. The music continued. Tim Buckley played his next song, his voice soaring through the room, beautiful and unaware. And Janis sat there, listening, thinking, deciding something. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Janis Joplin had been through in the months before that night. She had been told, in print and in person, that she was too loud, too rough, too much. She had been compared unfavorably to nearly every other female singer of her generation. She had been called a novelty. She had been called a phase. She had been called, in one particularly cruel review, a parody of herself. And every single time, she had answered the same way. Not with words. Not with arguments. But with another performance. Another song. Another night where she walked onto a stage and sang until the room had no choice but to admit that whatever she was doing, it was real. She was tired of defending herself with words. She had learned, very early in her career, that words were the wrong weapon for someone like her. Her weapon was her voice. And her voice only worked on a stage. So she made a decision. She would not say anything to Tim Buckley that night. She would not confront him. She would not argue. She would not even let him know she had been there. Instead, she would do what she always did. She would answer with a performance. But not just any performance. She would find a way, in the coming weeks, to share a stage with him. Or close enough to one. And she would let her voice do the talking. She finished her drink. She stood up. She walked out of the club without anyone noticing her. And she went home and did not sleep that night. But the story does not end there. Because the next morning, something happened that Janis had not expected. A friend called her. The friend had also been in the audience the night before, and had heard Tim Buckley's comment. The friend was furious. The friend wanted to know what Janis was going to do about it. Was she going to call Tim out in the press? Was she going to write a song? Was she going to confront him? Janis listened quietly. And then she said something that surprised her friend. She said, "What if he wasn't even talking about me?" Her friend laughed. Of course he was talking about you. Everyone knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. But Janis was not so sure. She had spent her whole life being told what other people meant by their words and their looks and their silences. And she had learned that sometimes the assumptions we make about other people's cruelty are heavier than the cruelty itself. This was a side of Janis that very few people saw. The thoughtful side. The careful side. The side that wanted to give other people the benefit of the doubt, even when she was not given the same courtesy in return. Yes, she was going to answer Tim Buckley with a performance. But she was not going to hate him. She was not going to make him an enemy. She was simply going to do what she did best, and let the results speak for itself. A few weeks later, the opportunity came. There was a multi-artist event scheduled at a venue in New York City. Several singers and bands would be performing on the same bill, including both Tim Buckley and Janis Joplin with Big Brother and the holding company. It was the kind of show where the order of performances mattered enormously. Whoever played last had the chance to leave the strongest impression. Whoever played early had to fight for attention from a crowd that was still settling in. Janis was scheduled to perform before Tim Buckley. When she found out, she did not complain. She did not ask for the order to be changed. She simply nodded, said thank you, and walked away. Her bandmates were confused. They knew the situation. They knew the story of what had happened in Greenwich Village. They expected her to demand the better slot. But Janis had already made her decision. She did not need the better slot. She just needed her voice. The night of the show arrived. The venue was packed. People from every corner of the New York music scene were there. Critics, producers, other musicians. The kind of crowd that could make or break a career in a single evening. Janis arrived early. She did not drink as much as usual before going on stage. She wore a simple outfit. She did not joke with her band the way she normally did. Something in her was focused in a way her bandmates had rarely seen. She walked onto the stage. The crowd applauded politely. She picked up the microphone. And then she began to sing. She did not start with one of her famous numbers. She did not open with a song designed to grab the audience by the throat. Instead, she began with something quieter, a slower song. Something that asked the audience to lean in and listen. The room shifted. People who had been talking at the back stopped talking. People who had been ordering drinks set their glasses down. The whole venue began to fold itself toward the small woman on the stage with the cracked, weathered voice. She sang for 30 minutes. Just 30 minutes. But in those 30 minutes, she did something that the people in that room would talk about for years afterward. She did not scream. She did not shout. She did not perform the wild, untamed Janis that the headlines were always describing. Instead, she sang with a kind of deliberate, careful intensity that nobody had quite seen from her before. Every note was placed exactly where it needed to be. Every breath was measured. Every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. She was answering Tim Buckley. But she was also answering every critic who had ever called her a screamer. Every reviewer who had ever said she was a one-trick performer. Every person who had ever told her that volume was not the same as emotion. She was showing them, all of them, that she could do both. That she could be loud when the song needed loudness, and quiet when the song needed quietness, and that the choice was always hers. When she finished her last song, the room did not erupt immediately. There was a beat of silence first. The kind of silence that only happens when an audience is genuinely stunned. And then the applause came. And it did not stop for a long time. Tim Buckley was backstage. He had heard everything. Years later, people who were there that night would describe what happened next in different ways. Some said that Tim Buckley walked out of his dressing room with a strange look on his face. Some said he stood at the side of the stage during the last few songs and did not move. Some said he simply went on after her, played a beautiful set of his own, and never spoke about it again. We do not know exactly what passed between them, if anything passed at all. There is no famous photograph of the two of them shaking hands. There is no recorded interview where either of them mentions the other by name. The whole story exists in the memories of people who were there, and memories are not always reliable witnesses. But here is what we do know. Tim Buckley, in the years that followed, never publicly criticized Janis Joplin again. Whatever he had said in that small club in Greenwich Village, whether it had been about her or not, he did not repeat it. And Janis, for her part, never named him as a rival. When asked about other singers in interviews, she was usually generous, sometimes funny, occasionally sharp, but rarely cruel. She did not need to be cruel. She had her voice. And this, perhaps, is the real lesson of that night. Not that Janis Joplin won some kind of contest. Not that she defeated Tim Buckley on a stage in New York City. The real lesson is that two very different artists, who might easily have spent their careers at war with each other, found a way to coexist. Without speeches. Without statements. Without the kind of public feud that the music press would have loved to write about. They simply made their music. They simply did their work. And they let history sort out the rest. But the story carries another layer, one that becomes clearer the more you sit with it. Janis Joplin was a woman who had been laughed at, mocked, and dismissed since she was a teenager. By the time she walked into that club in Greenwich Village in the spring of 1968, she had already developed a kind of armor. A way of absorbing the cruelty of the world without letting it stop her. But the armor was not made of anger. It was made of music. Every time someone tried to wound her, she answered with another song. Every time someone tried to make her smaller, she found a way to become larger on a stage. This was her method. This was her quiet, devastating revenge against a world that had never quite known what to do with her. And there is something almost beautiful about the fact that her answer to Tim Buckley, whatever Tim Buckley had actually said, was not a fight. It was a performance. She did not waste her energy on anger. She poured her energy into her work. She let her voice do what voices are supposed to do. She let it be heard. Many years after that night, when both Janis and Tim Buckley were no longer with us, journalists and historians would try to piece together the full story of what had happened in Greenwich Village in the spring of 1968. They would interview the people who claimed to have been there. They would compare different versions of the story. And they would discover, as is so often the case with stories about Janis Joplin, that the truth was harder to pin down than the legend. Some witnesses said Tim Buckley had clearly been talking about Janis. Other witnesses said he had been talking about a whole style of singing, and Janis had simply taken it personally. Some said the New York show afterward had been a triumphant answer. Others said it was just a regular night, and the connection between the two events was made up later by people who wanted a better story. Maybe all of these versions are partly true. Maybe none of them are. The history of music is full of these kinds of shadowy moments, where memory and myth blur together, and the only thing we can be sure of is that something happened. Some kind of friction. Some kind of tension. Some kind of moment between two people who were both trying to find their place in a world that was changing too fast for anyone to keep up. What is certain is this: Janis Joplin did not need to humiliate Tim Buckley. Tim Buckley did not need to apologize to Janis Joplin. Both of them were artists with their own gifts, their own struggles, their own short lives. Tim Buckley would die in 1975 at the age of 28. Janis Joplin would die in 1970 at the age of 27. Their lives barely overlapped. The window in which they could have been rivals, friends, or anything else was tragically narrow. And maybe that is why the story of that one night, whatever actually happened, has lasted as long as it has. Because it is not really a story about a feud. It is a story about two young people, both burning very brightly, both running out of time, who crossed paths for one strange evening in the spring of 1968. One of them said something. The other one heard it. And instead of turning it into a war, they turned it into music. There is a moment that the people closest to Janis would describe many years later. After the New York show, when she came off stage, she did not celebrate. She did not gloat. She did not ask anyone how she had done. She just sat down on a wooden crate backstage, lit a cigarette, and stared at the floor for a long time. One of her bandmates asked her if she was all right. She nodded, slowly. He asked her what she was thinking about. She did not answer for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, that she wished she did not always have to prove herself. She wished, just once, that she could walk onto a stage without having to answer somebody. Without having to fight for her place. Without having to be a question that the audience was asking, and the answer at the same time. This is the part of the story that the legend usually leaves out. The part where Janis Joplin, after delivering one of the most controlled, devastating performances of her career, sat alone backstage and felt tired. Not triumphant. Tired. Tired of always having to be the strongest voice in the room. Tired of always having to defend her right to exist as a singer, as a woman, as a Texan, as a person who did not look or sound like anyone else. The world had given her her voice, but it had also given her the burden of always having to use it for self-defense. And maybe that is why, when we look back at her short life, we should be careful about how we tell these stories. Because it is easy to turn Janis Joplin into a kind of warrior. A fighter who silenced everyone who doubted her. But the woman herself was more complicated than that. She was a fighter, yes. But she was also a person who would have liked, very much, to put her armor down. She was a person who was tired of fighting. She was a person who wanted, more than anything, to be loved without having to earn it every single night on a stage. And so when we hear the story of the night Tim Buckley may or may not have mocked her in a small Greenwich Village club, and the night she may or may not have answered him with a performance in New York, we should remember the part of the story that does not get told. The part where she sat backstage afterward, smoking a cigarette, wishing she could rest. Because that is the part that makes her human. That is the part that makes her real. That is the part that the legend, with all its drama and all its rivalry, can never quite capture. Janis Joplin was not a warrior. She was a singer. And every time she walked onto a stage, she was not just performing. She was carrying every wound, every doubt, Every cruel review, every whispered comment, every laughing audience from her childhood, every voice that had ever told her she was not enough. She was carrying all of it onto that stage with her. And she was turning it, somehow, into music that millions of people would still be listening to half a century later. That is the real story of that night in 1968. Not a feud. Not a victory. Not a humiliation. Just a young woman, doing what young women have always done when the world tries to make them small. She made herself larger. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. With song. And in the end, that is what we should remember about her. Not the rivalries. Not the rumors. Not the drama. Just the voice. The voice that came out of Port Arthur, Texas, and traveled across an entire generation, and is still traveling now, decades after the woman who carried it stopped being able to carry anything at all. The voice was the answer. The voice was always the answer. And on that strange night in the spring of 1968, in a city full of artists fighting for attention, Janis Joplin reminded everyone who was listening that the strongest answer is not the loudest one. It is the truest one. And the truest answer, for her, was always the same. It was always a song. Some artists fight with words. Some artists fight with silence. Janis Joplin fought with melody. And whether or not Tim Buckley ever apologized, whether or not he had even been talking about her in the first place, whether or not the whole story was exaggerated by people who wanted a better legend, the truth at the heart of it remains the same. She did not need to win that night. She only needed to sing. And when she sang, the room understood. The room always understood. That was the gift she gave us, and the gift she gave herself, in the few short years she had on stages around the world. A voice that did not need to argue. A voice that did not need to defend itself. A voice that simply was. And in being, answered every question that anyone had ever asked about it. That was Janis Joplin. That was her quiet revenge against a world that had never been quite kind enough to her. Not a fight. Not a feud. Just a song, sung exactly the way she meant to sing it. And a silence afterward, in which everyone who heard it finally understood.